Hi, my name is Debbie Ma. I'm a professor of psychology at California State University, Northridge, and in today's mini lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about the social psychological research that has been done to try to understand police officers' decision to shoot. Research on this topic began in 1999 following the shooting death of Amadou Diallo, who is pictured here. Diallo was an immigrant from West Africa who was living in New York City when 4 plainclothes police officers, all white, spotted him and matched him to the description of a wanted serial rapist in the area. 2 of the officers left the car and approached Diallo and asked him to see his hands. At that time, Diallo entered his apartment building foyer. One of the police officers then, following him, yelled, "Gun, he's got a gun," and the officers opened fire, ultimately discharging 41 bullets, 19 of which struck Diallo, and he died at the scene. When it came time to recover the gun that one of the officers said he spotted, all they were able to find was Diallo's black wallet. This prompted researchers to try to understand whether or not the race of Amadou Diallo impacted police officers' decision to open fire and possibly led those officers to misperceive the object that Diallo was holding as a gun instead of a wallet. Leading the charge were some of these researchers pictured here, and they asked that simple question: does the race of an individual play a role in the decision to shoot that individual? Some of the research that I'm going to talk about today was conducted by the individual pictured on the top row on the far right, Professor Josh Carell, who's at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Josh Carell developed this video game. It's referred to sometimes as the first-person shooter task, and he developed this kind of video game in response to the Diallo shooting to try to simulate in the lab what the police officers' decisions might look like. So in this game, participants see several background screens, and after some random number, a target will pop up in the screen, and that target can either be armed or unarmed and is either white or black. So I'm giving you some images here of what those targets looked like. Here is an unarmed white target. And participants complete about 100 trials of this task in which the targets, again, are either black or white and are either armed or unarmed, and we can look at the kind of mistakes that people make on this task. So here I'm plotting for you the mistakes that people make by the type of object that they're carrying and the race of the target. So we can see when the targets are armed, participants make relatively fewer mistakes when the target is black than when the target is white. By contrast, when the target is not armed, participants are more likely to say shoot accidentally and mistakenly shooting an unarmed black target than mistakenly shooting an unarmed white target. And this pattern represents racial bias. We can also look at the reaction times or the time it takes for participants to execute an accurate response. What we do is we make participants make their judgments more quickly, and we shrink the response window that participants can make their judgments in. And so what I'm plotting for you here is also the decision that participants make, but this is actually the reaction time it takes for them to make correct decisions. So higher values here means slower reaction time, slower response time. And so we can see that when the targets are white, they're faster to make the correct decision when that white target is unarmed, but the reverse is true for when the targets are black. When the targets are black, they're much faster to accurately say that the target is armed than they are to say that the black target is unarmed. And this is true of both white participants as well as black participants. So we say that participants respond faster to stereotype congruent trials. And the stereotype that we're picking up on here is the cultural stereotype in the United States that Black men are physically aggressive or dangerous or criminal. So the first-person shooter task relies on this cultural association linking Black males to danger stereotypes. And we know from decades of research that stereotypes are these mental shortcuts that people take to save time and energy. So a question that we can reasonably ask is, what happens when people have even less time or even less mental energy to devote to decision making? So when people are cognitively busy or when they're tired, we know that they should probably rely on stereotypes even more. And that would mean that these biases that we observe on the first-person shooter task should be even greater under these conditions. And this is a highly relevant decision to policing because we know that police officers are highly fatigued. In an assessment of how fatiguing different professions are, police officers rank within the top 5. And in a 2000 report conducted by the Department of Justice, it was found that police officers, 41% of them were at clinical levels of sleep deprivation, and that 6.2% of them were so sleep deprived that their physiological impairments were equivalent to a person who had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.10. So policing is a very tiring profession. And this has to do with a host of different factors, including shift work, working night shift, and police officers sometimes working multiple jobs because of low pay and a multitude of other reasons. So here we can see that at 0.10 levels of blood alcohol concentration, some of the impairments have to do with reaction time, gross motor control, and reflexes. And these are things that are obviously very important for police officers when they're making that decision, that life or death decision about whether or not they should shoot an individual or whether or not they perceive somebody as dangerous. So in some research that we did, we looked at undergraduates from the University of Chicago who completed the first-person shooter task after first being assigned to one of 2 experimental conditions. There was a control condition, and then there was a condition that we cognitively depleted. This means that we had them do a task before they completed the first-person shooter task that would give them a temporary state of diminished control by making them do a boring task that relied on a lot of higher order executive functions before they did the first-person shooter task. And then we gave them the first-person shooter task with a relatively longer response window so we could look to see how that cognitive depletion impacted the reaction times that they had on the first-person shooter task. And what I'm plotting for here is the reaction times. The bars on the left will be for the control condition, and the bars on the right will be for the cognitive depletion condition. And so what we can see on the bars on the left is a typical pattern of racial bias. Participants are generally slower to accurately recognize a target is unarmed than when they're armed. And here they show a modest facilitation for recognizing Black targets are armed relative to unarmed, but those 2 red bars are not statistically different from each other, though together these 4 bars do show racial bias because of the difference between the blue and the red bar being smaller for the white targets than for the Black targets. What we really want to look at is then what happens with these cognitively depleted participants. And what we can see is that this pattern is exacerbated. The difference between the red and blue bars for the Black targets in this condition is much bigger than it is for the white targets. And we can plot that by looking at just that difference score, and we can see that for the control condition, there's a significant amount of racial bias, and that racial bias is even bigger for the cognitively depleted participants. So we would conclude that cognitively depleted participants show more racial bias in reaction times on the first-person shooter task. We can also ask what happens in the real world. So obviously this kind of fatigue is something that we induced in the lab, and it's somewhat temporary. But what happens when police officers are not getting enough sleep? So in this study, what we did was this is an observational study where we took basic recruits who were being trained for a very large police department in the United States, and they completed the first-person shooter task with a 700 millisecond response window. And they also answered 2 questions to do with sleep. How many hours of sleep did you get last night? And on average, how many hours of sleep do you get each night? And then we looked at the mistakes that participants made, and we can see that the error rates are much greater for Black unarmed targets than for the other conditions. So again, this shows the basic pattern of racial bias in the errors that people make in the first-person shooter task. From the decisions that participants make on the first-person shooter task, we can also derive 2 other statistics. The first one is referred to as D prime, and it's a measure of sensitivity. It tells us how well people are able to discriminate objects from weapons in this task. And we can see that participants actually have better discriminability for Black targets than they do for white targets. And so these recruits showed greater discriminability for Black targets than white targets. We can also look at another statistic that's referred to as the criterion, and it tells us kind of how trigger happy participants are. If a criterion is lower, that means that participants are relatively, they show a lower threshold in order to make a shoot decision. And we know that, at least for this sample, recruits had a lower threshold to shoot Blacks than they did for whites. And we can relate that to fatigue by looking at how correlated participants' self-reported sleep was to these different metrics that we get from the first-person shooter. So we see that on the top row, how many hours of sleep the participant reported the night before completing the study was significantly related to the pattern of errors that they made, the racial bias in the errors they made, as well as their sensitivity. And when we look at how many hours of sleep that these recruits reported typically getting in a night, that's correlated with the threshold that they set for shooting and not shooting. That is a marginal effect. So self-reported sleep habits do seem to matter for the racial bias that people show on the first-person shooter task. Now, there's a lot of room to explore other moderators, and some of these things have been looked at. The first-person shooter task is obviously not a very realistic task, so we can use something called a firearms training simulator, which more closely approximates the kind of decision context police officers find themselves in. We can look at the effect of training, whether or not more training against racial bias might have an impact in improving or mitigating racial bias on this task. There is some research to show that police officers who work in special units, like in the gang unit, for instance, show even greater patterns of racial bias. One question is whether or not particular units might be associated with less bias. And we can try to understand what about those police officing units might lead to less racial bias, so that we can try to train other officers on those, whatever those psychological constructs might be. And we can also look at arousal. So in this task, on the first-person shooter task, it's obviously not a real life or death situation for the participants. If we make it so through arousal, maybe caffeine administration or the threat of a shock, we can see whether or not that might also play a role. So our research on this topic is far from over, and there's still a lot of interesting questions that are being asked, and a lot of room for future research, even from undergraduates and new grad students.